Wharfdale, North Yorkshire, Thursday morning, 7 February, 1952, 20 past 8. Agnes Moorhouse, 57, had been sub-postmistress of the village general store and post office at Grassington since 1931. She had the postal counter open before the shop shelves were restocked, because Thursday was pension day, and on pension day, the first knock came. Before the kettle had boiled, the wooden counter with its brass grille had been there before she came to it. The GPO scales stood to the left of the grille, stamped and certified, with the weights in a tray beside them. The stamp drawers ran in a column behind her: penny stamps, 3 penny stamps, 6 penny stamps, airmail labels. The pension book register was in the drawer below the counter, the one she kept locked when the money was in it. She had been doing this since 1931, and she knew, without looking at the clock, when the first pensioner would reach the gate. The village stood on the eastern edge of the Yorkshire Dales, a market square, a church, a pub, a school, a handful of shops. The sub-post office was identifiable from the street by 2 things: the royal cipher above the door and the red pillar box mounted on the exterior wall beside it. The pillar box had the collection times stenciled below the slot. Agnes Moorhouse knew which morning collection the postman had reached by the time she opened the grille. She had been noting it for 20 years. What Thursday's first pensioner would bring with her, besides her pension book, was news. The farm road north of the village had ice on it. Mrs. Wilkinson's daughter had written from Leeds. The postman had come up the Dale Road earlier than usual, which meant the bag from Skipton had arrived on the early van. Agnes Moorhouse did not ask for this information. It arrived at her counter with the pension book, in the natural course of a Thursday morning, in a village that had one place where everyone came. What did it mean? In 1952, in a Yorkshire Dales village, that the sub-post office was the one institution in which the whole community had a transaction to perform. And what did the person behind the counter accumulate over 20 years of those transactions that no post office record had ever asked her to write down? Before you can understand what Agnes Moorhouse had built at Grassington by 1952, you need to understand what a sub-post office was in the legal and operational sense. Because it was not a post office. It was a contract. The General Post Office did not build sub-post offices. It appointed sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses, men and women who already ran a business in a community too small to support a full Crown post office. And it gave them a formal contract to provide postal services from their existing premises. By the early 1920s, this arrangement had produced a network of approximately 14,000 sub-post offices across Britain, the overwhelming majority of them in villages exactly like Grassington, a general store with a postal counter fitted into it, a newsagent's with a grille at the back, sometimes no more than a front room given over to the purpose. Agnes Moorhouse's contract specified precisely what she could and could not do from behind that counter. She sold stamps and postal orders. She weighed parcels on GPO scales that had been stamped and certified by an inspector who visited on his own schedule, not hers. She paid out old age pensions, payable at post office counters since the 1st of January, 1909, against a pension book. She checked line by line. She took in savings deposits and issued money orders. She sent and received telegrams. Every one of these transactions followed a procedure set down by the GPO, and every one of them was inspected, audited, and could be withdrawn from her if she failed to perform it correctly. What the contract did not specify, what no GPO manual anywhere described, was what happened to a person who performed these exact transactions for the same families, across 20 or 30 years. What Agnes Moorhouse knew about every family in Grassington from 37 years behind the counter, and why no institution, when the grille finally closed, inherited a single fact of what she held. What did Agnes Moorhouse's contract require of her that had nothing to do with knowing her customers, and what had 2 decades behind the counter given her, that the contract had never asked for, and never once mentioned? Before we continue, If this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Royal Mail, between 1,900 and 1,980, the vehicle, the round, the sorting office, and the letter that the system carried. Not nostalgia for red pillar boxes. The documented operational reality of a postal system and the specific human meaning of what it handled. Before the telephone changed what it meant to post a letter in a village where everyone knew your name. What Agnes Moorhouse knew about every family in Grassington from 37 years behind the counter, and why no institution, when the grille finally closed, inherited a single fact of what she held. And if you remember your village sub-post office, the person behind the counter, the stamp drawers, the smell of gum on the back of a penny stamp, put it in the comments. Did you ever hand a letter to the sub-postmistress that you would not have dropped anonymously in a city pillar box? What did handing it to a familiar face change about the act of sending it? Next on this channel, the Christmas post at its peak. What the seasonal surge meant for sorting offices in December 1944. And what the postman carrying a card from the Italian front knew that the card itself was not permitted to say. Back on the round. You did not set out to learn that Mrs. Kettlewell collected her pension every Thursday without fail, and that the Thursday she missed in the autumn of 1948 meant something had happened at the farm. You learned it by being present, every postal working day, at the single point in the community through which all official and semi-official correspondence passed. This knowledge was not gossip. Agnes Moorhouse was professionally discreet in the way that her GPO contract required her to be. She did not discuss the contents of a registered item or speculate about why a particular household was receiving letters from a government department, or share what the handwriting on an envelope told her about where it had come from. Her discretion was generally recognized and respected in the village, in the way a doctor's discretion is recognized, not because the community was unaware that she held information, but because they understood that she could be trusted with it. In 1949, a Member of Parliament, speaking in the House of Commons on village sub-post offices, noted that sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses were the source, not only of information, but very often of guidance and counsel to the people of the village. This was a parliamentary observation about a function that was nowhere in the GPO's formal job description, and nowhere in Agnes Moorhouse's contract. What did 20 years of being trusted with the full correspondence of a village produce in the person who held it? And what did the families of Grassington understand about Agnes Moorhouse? That no outside visitor to the village, arriving for the first time, could have understood without the same 20 years of transactions behind the same counter. The act of posting a letter at the village sub-post office was not the same act as dropping it in a city pillar box. This is not sentiment. It is an operational and social fact. When a resident of Grassington posted a letter at Agnes Moorhouse's counter, the letter was handed to a person. It was weighed on the GPO scales. The correct postage was calculated and the stamps were affixed or advised. If it was a registered item, a document sent to a solicitor, a letter containing money, an envelope, the sender had a reason to track. It was entered in the registered post book and a receipt was issued. The sender had a record. Agnes Moorhouse had a record. The item was then placed in the outgoing bag, which the village postman would collect on his way through, or which the collection van from Skipton would take when it came up the Dale. None of this was different, in procedural terms, from the same transaction at a Crown Post Office in Bradford or Leeds. The procedure was identical. What was different was the person performing it. The sub-postmistress at Grassington had, in 1952, known the family of virtually every person who brought a letter to her counter. She had known, in many cases, their parents. She was not, and could not be, an anonymous clerk behind a grille. What did it change for a person posting a letter that mattered to hand it across a counter to a face that already knew whose letter it was and what it was likely to mean? And what did the incoming post, the letters that arrived, rather than the ones that left, reveal to Agnes Moorhouse before they ever reached the household they were addressed to? Before the telephone became a common household fixture in rural Britain, the telegram was the fastest form of personal communication available to a village. In Grassington in 1952, a telegram sent at Agnes Moorhouse's counter would be transmitted through the GPO wire network to the nearest telegraph office, and from there relayed to its destination. A telegram received for a village address would arrive at the nearest telegraph office and be relayed onward in rural areas, often by the postman on his round, or collected at the sub-post office itself. The telegram service operated through the same counter that sold stamps and weighed parcels. Agnes Moorhouse was trained in the procedure. The message was written on the prescribed form, the words counted and the charge calculated, the transmission confirmed. For the sender, the telegram carried a specific gravity that a letter did not. You sent a telegram when a letter would not arrive in time. You sent a telegram when the news was too urgent to wait for the post. Agnes Moorhouse knew, as every experienced sub-postmistress in a rural community knew, what a telegram meant when someone brought one in to send. She did not ask what it contained. The form she was given contained the text, and the text was necessary for transmission. She also knew what it meant when a delivery from the Skipton office arrived with a telegram rather than the ordinary bag, because telegrams did not come sealed inside the morning bag with the letters. They came separately. They arrived on their own. In villages where the sub-post office held the only public telephone until well into the mid-20th century, and in some, it did. Agnes Moorhouse's counter was also the point from which an emergency call could be made. In an operational sense, she was the communications hub of the village in both directions, outgoing and incoming, postal and telegraphic, formal and urgent. What had Agnes Moorhouse seen arrive at her counter, across 20 years, that the families of Grassington had been waiting for, with a kind of urgency that no letter could carry, between September 1939 and August 1945. The sub-post office at Grassington, like every sub-post office across Britain, handled correspondence within a postal system operating under wartime conditions. Letters from active service arrived in the sealed morning bag from Skipton, sorted with the ordinary post on active service, printed on the envelope, sometimes with the censor's mark, the contents already read and passed before dispatch from the theatre. Letters going out to forces' addresses were posted at the counter in the normal way, stamped, entered in the outgoing bag, collected. Agnes Moorhouse saw every piece of wartime correspondence that passed through the Grassington counter. She saw the on-active service envelopes arrive in the morning bag before the households they were addressed to knew they had come. She saw letters posted to forces' post office addresses, some of them from women writing to men whose exact whereabouts could not be disclosed, even in the address. She saw telegram deliveries arrive from Skipton on their own, separate from the morning bag, in years when a telegram arriving at a village door carried a weight that everyone in the community understood. She did not, and could not, know the contents of any of it. Postal censorship in wartime operated before the letter reached Britain. The content had already been read and passed or excised before it entered the domestic system. What she saw was the exterior, the handwriting, the postmark, the volume. 2 letters in a fortnight from the same theatre, then silence for a month. A letter that had been resealed after the censor's inspection, with the approval mark across the flap. A registered item from the War Office, not the telegram, which came separately, but the registered letter, which arrived in the bag like any other registered item, and was held at the counter until someone from the addressed family came to collect it. What did it mean to be the person who held the registered letter from the War Office at the counter and waited? And what had Agnes Moorhouse understood by 1945 about what the exterior of an envelope could carry that its sender had never set out to communicate? Village life at Grassington accommodated the sub-post office's hours in ways that had nothing to do with the GPO contract and everything to do with how a small community actually ran. Pensions were collected on a fixed day, so Thursday mornings had a rhythm that Wednesday mornings did not. Correspondence was posted with an eye on the collection time, stenciled beneath the pillar box slot, miss the second collection, and a letter waited until the next day's van from Skipton. On the morning after the postman's round, it was not unusual for a family who had received an important letter to walk down to the shop that housed the sub-post office, ostensibly for milk or matches, and mention, in the course of the transaction, what the letter had said. In a community where news travelled by conversation as much as by post, the arrival of correspondence at Agnes Moorhouse's counter was itself a form of village event, not because she disclosed anything, but because everyone knew that she, of all the people in Grassington, had seen the envelope first. The limitations of the sub-post office were as real as its social function. Agnes Moorhouse's working hours were fixed by her contract, and outside them, the counter was simply closed. Her products and procedures were fixed too. There were things a sub-post office in a village the size of Grassington was not equipped to do, and for those a customer had to travel to the nearest Crown Post Office in Skipton, several miles down the Dale. The telegram service, essential in the first half of the century for news that could not wait for the post, was expensive to send and entirely dependent on a wider GPO wire network functioning correctly at every point along the line. A dependency, a rural sub-postmistress, had no way to influence and no way to repair if it failed. In a genuinely remote community, the sub-post office was often the only point at which official correspondence could be sent or received at all. This meant that its closure for a holiday, an illness, or simply because Agnes Moorhouse herself was unwell, left the village, for as long as the counter stayed shut, without its only formal channel to the world beyond the Dale. No pension could be collected, no registered item could be handed over, no telegram could be sent. One pair of hands behind the grille was, in a very literal operational sense, the village's entire postal and communications infrastructure, and there was no institutional redundancy built in should those hands be absent. What happened to a village like Grassington on the days when the counter did not open? And what does that tell us about how much of the village's formal contact with the world beyond the Dale had come to depend on one? A pointed, singular pair of hands. The sub-post office network that had reached approximately 14,000 outlets across Britain by the early 20th century began its long contraction through the 1970s and 1980s. Car ownership expanded. Rural economies changed. The post office restructured. Sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses retired, and their successors were not always found. In May 2007, the government approved the Post Office Network Change Programme, and by the time it concluded in 2009, some 2,500 sub-post offices had been closed from a network of roughly 14,000, reducing the total to fewer than 12,000. Research confirmed that the closures fell disproportionately on the most rural communities, the villages that had depended most completely on their sub-post office as their only local financial and communications institution. Agnes Moorhouse retired from the Grassington counter in 1968. She had been sub-postmistress for 37 years. The counter grill was there when she left. The GPO scales were there. The stamp drawers were there. What was not there was 37 years of accumulated knowledge about every family in the valley whose correspondence had passed across that counter, who was receiving letters from which cities, which households had been waiting for a pension since the Thursday they last came in, which of the farms had stopped sending registered items to the same solicitor, and what that change had meant. That knowledge had no institutional form. It had existed in one person, at one counter, for 37 years. When she retired, it retired with her. The telephone had begun arriving in rural households from the early 1960s. What it gave the village: immediacy, a voice in the same moment rather than 2 weeks later. The ability to ask a second question and have the answer at once. What it could not give them: the sub-postmistress at the counter who had known their family for 30 years, who had seen the registered letter from the solicitor arrive before they had, who had handed the pension book back to the same hands every Thursday with the same familiar recognition that the transaction was never merely a transaction. The mobile van that replaced the counter in some villages attended once or twice a week. It performed the transactions the GPO contract had specified. It did not know which household had not collected a pension book in 3 weeks. It did not know what the morning bag had contained. No form was filed. No record was kept. The counter at Grassington did not know what it had lost, because the thing it had lost had never been required to exist. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Royal Mail carried and what it meant to the people who received it, subscribe. There are more rounds, more sorting offices, more letters from active service, more emigrant envelopes that arrived at a door where someone had been going to the window every time a red van turned into the street. Agnes Moorhouse knew things about the families of Grassington that no archive has ever recorded, because no one asked her to record them. What she knew from being present at the counter, the one point where the full correspondence of a community, outgoing and incoming, was handled by a single pair of hands. What is lost when that counter closes is not a postal service. It is the institution that held the knowledge. And if you remember your village sub-post office, if you remember the person behind the counter, or a letter that arrived at a door where the family had been waiting, put it in the comments. Did the sub-postmistress in your village know what the post meant to your family before you did? Next on this channel, the Christmas post at its peak, what the seasonal surge meant for the men and women working the December night sort, and what the postman, carrying a Christmas card from a son on the Italian front, understood that the card itself was not permitted to say. Agnes Moorhouse retired from the Grassington counter in 1968. She had been sub-postmistress for 37 years. The counter grille, the GPO scales, the stamp drawers, these remained. What they did not retain was the knowledge of who had posted at that counter, what they had been sending, and what they had been waiting for. That knowledge had no institutional form.